My Jehovah's Witness family disowned me for being gay. Then my younger brother catfished them into thinking I'd returned. I grew up in a Jehovah's Witness household so conservative that most people would call it I was not allowed to read Harry Potter or engage with anything the church deemed worldly. My parents enforced every rule with absolute vigilance and showed no leniency, even for the slightest infractions. In our small Midwestern town, the reputation of Jehovah's Witnesses preceded us. Everyone knew we were the family that refused birthday parties, banned Halloween costumes, and knocked on doors early Saturday mornings. I learned from a young age to accept that as normal, though I always felt a small itch of discomfort with certain teachings. But I tried to ignore it because in a witness household there's no room for doubt. You comply, or you face serious consequences. When I was 13, I realized I was gay, though I couldn't bear to speak or even think those words for a long time. My awareness started with fleeting glances in school corridors, a sudden racing of my heart when I locked eyes with a boy I found inexplicably captivating. I stuffed down that recognition in the way you might try to hold your breath underwater until your lungs scream. In our congregation, anything even hinting at homosexuality was met with unambiguous condemnation. People gossiped about such sins, whispered about disfellowshipping, and nodded sternly at the mention of Sodom and Gomorrah. The fear of being outed kept me up at night, sometimes trembling in bed as I prayed desperately for Jehovah to make me straight. I was convinced I was broken and that if God truly saw everything, maybe he'd fix me. But he never did. Every day I went through the motions in our Kingdom Hall, standing during songs, listening dutifully to the talks, raising my hand occasionally to comment in the Watchtower study. My parents smiled approvingly when I quoted scripture. They thought I was devout and obedient, and I tried so hard to keep that illusion alive. But beneath my carefully controlled surface was a constant state of anxiety. I watched every word I said, every expression that crossed my face. I was terrified my father or my older sister might pick up on the slightest hint of my real identity. The slightest misstep, and my entire life would be turned upside down. I just wanted to hold on until I was 18, or maybe 19, and then quietly slip away, hopefully with enough resources to start over somewhere else. That small hope was my only lifeline. My mother was the epitome of JW devoutness. She spent hours preparing for our congregation's weekly meetings, carefully underlining passages in the magazines and Bible study guides. My father was equally strict, working long hours during the week but never missing a chance to lecture us on morality. My older sister followed diligently in their footsteps. She was 2 years older than me, always proud to highlight her unwavering faith. Meanwhile, my little brother was only 6, a bright-eyed kid who still smiled at everyone and seemed oblivious to the constant pressure that existed in our house. He was my sole daily source of uncomplicated joy. I loved him fiercely, and a part of me felt guilty knowing that if I ever got caught being who I was, I could lose him as well. That, more than anything, kept me up at night. It wasn't just the big things that made our life stifling. It was the sum of 1,000 small prohibitions. No holidays, no birthdays, no after-school clubs, no casually hanging out with worldly classmates. If I wanted to attend a school event, I needed a compelling reason that showed it wasn't too closely tied to worldly culture. And my parents were well aware of the content I consumed. Any TV shows or books that so much as hinted at magic or the occult were deemed dangerous. Harry Potter was off the table. Pokemon cards were rumored to be demonized, so those were banned too. Even many Disney movies were suspect. At first I thought maybe all families had these sorts of rules. But by the time I was 10 or 11, I realized just how drastically different my family was. I coped the only way I could, by hiding in plain sight. I became the perfect little witness in public, shaking hands and smiling when older members of the congregation praised my maturity. But whenever I was alone, I let down the mask. I found a small sense of freedom in the early days of using the internet. I searched out whatever content I could find about being gay, though it was terrifying because I had to constantly clear the browsing history. I became adept at covering my tracks, erasing cookies, and deleting files. But no system is foolproof, and the day came when I slipped up. One fateful afternoon, my sister decided to review the family computer's browsing history. She and my parents believed it was their duty to monitor me for bad influences, ensuring I wasn't tempted by immoral material. I'd been meticulous for months, deleting evidence of any gay-themed websites or images. But that day, something went wrong. Maybe I forgot to clear the history. Maybe I got interrupted and didn't realize I'd left behind a link or some data. Whatever the cause, she discovered it. Gape, right there in the browser history. It was like a grenade went off. I returned home from school to find the entire family gathered in the living room. My father was pacing, scowling deeply, his Bible open on the coffee table. My mother sat on the couch with tears in her eyes. My sister stood in the corner, arms folded, looking self-satisfied and horrified at the same time. And there in the middle of the room was my little brother, looking more confused than I'd ever seen him. My father curtly told me to sit. Heart pounding, hands shaking, I sat. They confronted me about what my sister had found. My father read scripture after scripture about immorality, lumps of condemnation that felt like lead being dropped on my head. My mother sobbed, hands over her face. My sister was stone-faced. At one point, she blurted out how disgusting it was to see the history I left behind. My little brother, at 6, had no grasp of the real situation, only that everyone in the house was suddenly upset. My father told me in a harsh voice that this was a betrayal of everything our family believed in. He said if I wanted to stay in the house, I would need to agree to get help, by which he meant conversion therapy, JW style, with elders who specialized in curing homosexuality. If I refused, then I would have to leave. I tried to absorb that ultimatum, but all I could feel was terror washing over me. I glanced at my mother, but she simply looked away, tears streaming down her face. I glanced at my sister, but she glared at me as though I were a sickness that had infected our home. My brother looked uncertain, stepping forward as if to reach out to me. My father told him to go to his room. I wanted to grab him and hug him, but I didn't dare move. A few hours later, my aunt swooped in like a last-minute miracle. I barely knew her, because she'd left the Jehovah's Witnesses years earlier under circumstances my parents never fully explained. They considered her spiritually dangerous and forbade me to communicate with her. But she was the only person I could think to call. When she answered and I managed to tell her in a shaky voice that I'd been kicked out, her tone immediately shifted from confusion to fierce protectiveness. She showed up at our house that same night with her car, told me to grab my bag and hustled me away. My mother never came out to say goodbye. My father refused to speak to me. My sister stood in the door, her face unreadable. And just like that, I was gone. I remember leaning back in the passenger seat of my aunt's car, numb and trembling. She kept one hand on the steering wheel while reaching over occasionally to pat my shoulder, whispering that everything would be okay. In that moment, I had no idea if I would ever see my little brother again. He was only 6, and I had never gotten the chance to explain anything to him. I cried for half the drive, my heart splitting over the realization that my family, except for my aunt, had basically disowned me. Even in that fog of heartbreak, I felt a strange sense of relief. There would be no more tension over hiding my true self. I was terrified of the unknown, but at least I didn't have to keep living under the shadow of rigid condemnation. Over the next few months, my aunt's home became a sanctuary. She lived a few hours away near Chicago, a drastically different environment from our small-town life. The city felt overwhelming at first. The noise, the diversity, the sheer freedom of walking down the street without worrying if a JW elder might see me. My aunt enrolled me in a local high school, where I struggled to fit in at first, but gradually made some friends. A few teachers reached out when they sensed something was off, and I confided in them more than I expected. Through therapy and a slow process of rebuilding my self-esteem, I discovered that the world was not as terrifying as I had been taught. There were people who accepted me without question, people who didn't think of me as broken or sinful. It felt like a whole new universe. Despite everything, I missed my little brother so much it hurt. I sometimes woke up from dreams of him, a small, bright-eyed kid running up to give me a hug. At 6, he was too young to have an email or a phone I could secretly call. My parents cut all lines of communication to me. No letters, no calls, no updates. I heard occasional rumors from extended family or saw fleeting mentions on social media, but I had no direct contact with him. I told myself that maybe one day, when he was older, we could reconnect. I hoped fiercely that somehow he'd remember me, that he'd understand I didn't abandon him by choice. By the time I reached my early 20s, I had a steady part-time job in a local coffee shop, was taking some college courses at night, and had begun to see a future for myself that my 16-year-old self could hardly have imagined. I learned how to rely on my own instincts, how to trust that my worth wasn't tied to a religion that cast me out. But every once in a while, I'd wonder if my family ever thought of me. Did my sister regret outing me so harshly? Did my little brother even remember me? Then, out of nowhere, a message appeared in my Facebook inbox from a name that made my heart nearly stop. It was my brother, now 15 years old. He wrote a long note, stumbling over how to apologize for never saying goodbye, how he wished he could have kept in touch, how he'd spent years wondering if I was okay. I read it 3 times, tears slipping down my cheeks. Then I clicked on his profile. He didn't post any overtly JW content. His page looked like that of a fairly normal teenage, snapshots with friends at school, comments about basketball, memes. There was no sign of the controlling religious environment. I wondered how he had navigated that in the house of our parents, who were still devout Jehovah's Witnesses. Regardless, I felt a surge of hope that maybe he was free to be his own person. I replied right away, typing a response with trembling fingers. We ended up messaging back and forth for hours. catching up on the broad strokes of each other's lives. He told me he still lived with our parents, still had to attend the Kingdom Hall, but he'd become disillusioned with the faith. He talked about the tension he felt every day, part of the JW, but doubting. We decided to FaceTime that weekend. I'll never forget the moment I saw his face on my phone screen. Older but still so obviously the kid I knew. We both burst into tears and laughed at ourselves for being so emotional. It felt like a miracle to see him after all those years. We started talking regularly, a few times a week. He'd call me during lunch at school or from a friend's house, and we'd chat about normal life stuff. His classes, sports, music, the funny things teenagers do. He admitted he had no real space at home to be himself. Our parents monitored everything, so he called me when he was safely out of earshot. Whenever I asked how they would react if they knew he was talking to me, he'd shudder and say he didn't want to think about it. He told me he had grown to resent the suffocating rules, that he'd been punished for small infractions and was frightened about what would happen if they learned he'd reestablished contact with me, the apostate. For a while, it was a precarious but joyful arrangement. We were reconnecting in secret, forging the bond we'd been denied. Then, seemingly out of left field, I received an email from my mother. After years of nothing, she sent me a brief note with an attached family photo from a recent trip to the Dells. She wrote something along the lines of, "Hope you're well, we thought of you on our vacation." It was surreal. I forwarded the email to friends, asking why she would suddenly reach out as though nothing had happened. Several people suggested it might be a trap or some kind of half-hearted attempt at reconciliation. Another friend commented, "Maybe your brother told them you're thinking of coming back." That comment festered in my mind. So during our next phone call, I gently mentioned the email to my brother. I said I didn't want to accuse him of anything, but I asked if he knew why my mom would contact me like that. He went quiet, and I sensed his breathing grow shaky. Then he spilled the whole story. He had lied to our parents, telling them that I had reached out to him begging for forgiveness and desperately wanting to return to Jehovah's Witnesses. He concocted a fake Instagram account, using my photos, some with my best friend Julie, and labeling them with captions about how I'd rediscovered my faith, how I was so happy to be cleansed of my worldly sins. He even put captions on photos of Julie, calling her my fiancée, to prove that I was now a heterosexual guy with plans to marry in Jehovah's light. I sat there, stunned, my phone pressed to my ear. I asked why on earth he would do that. His voice cracked as he tried to explain. He felt trapped, wanted to see me, and believed that if our parents thought I was a repentant witness, they'd allow him more freedom to visit me or even let us rebuild the family bond without suspicion. He was 15, stuck in a toxic environment, and had thought this elaborate ruse was the only way to achieve any semblance of contact. I could hear the regret in his voice. He apologized repeatedly, saying he was terrified of losing me again but also scared of how our parents would react if they knew the truth. He admitted he was panicking, that he'd spun a web too large to maintain. At first, I was speechless. It was like something out of a bizarre sitcom or a movie, except it was painfully real. I was furious at the deception, yet I couldn't be mad at him for long because I heard the desperation in his voice. He was a frightened kid trying to manipulate a system that gave him no agency over his own life. Still, I told him firmly that I couldn't participate in this charade. I was not going to pretend to be straight or beg the congregation for forgiveness, nor was I interested in re-establishing contact with our parents under false pretenses. I told him to delete the fake Instagram immediately. He promised he would, and he did. Soon afterward, we had a more honest talk. He confided that he was miserable at home. He understood the Jehovah's Witness belief system well enough now to see that it was controlling, that it threatened to disown anyone who questioned it, and that it had a narrow, suffocating worldview. He still believed in God, but wanted to explore different Christian denominations, to attend services quietly and see if there was a version of faith that resonated with him. But in our hometown, that was impossible to do without being recognized. If anyone from the congregation or from town noticed, it would get back to my parents. He'd be labeled bad association or an apostate. He said flat out that if they discovered how strongly he felt, they'd probably throw him out, the way they threw me out. And he was terrified because, as a 15-year-old kid, how was he supposed to manage on his own? He had no job, no car, and no money. That anxiety had driven him to concoct the story of my supposed reconversion, hoping he could somehow use that to slip away and see me in Chicago. But now it had all blown up in his face. I was angry about being used as a pawn in his deception, but mostly I was heartbroken by his circumstances. Nobody should have to lie about their family or hide who they are just to survive. I told him I forgave him, that we could move on from the scheme and that I wanted to be a lifeline for him should he ever need to leave home. I said I would help him pay for a train ticket, let him stay with me or with our aunt, enroll him in high school here if necessary, do whatever it took to keep him safe. He started crying again, this time sounding relieved. He whispered that he was grateful to have that option, but he was still scared, still uncertain of how to make such a big move. For now, he'd keep his head down at home while secretly venting to me about the more oppressive aspects of the congregation. After that conversation, he officially ended the catfish. He told our parents that he no longer heard from me, that I might be going to another church, that I didn't seem interested in returning to the watchtower. In a way, that half-lie satisfied them. Maybe they still harbored some faint hope I'd be rescued by Jehovah's grace in another setting. Regardless, my brother no longer fed them stories of my pious journey. My mother hasn't emailed me again, and my father remains in the background, no doubt suspicious but not sure how to proceed. My sister occasionally posts barbed comments on social media, praising the purity of the congregation and condemning worldly lifestyles, but has never reached out to me personally. She's become deeply entrenched in the JW life, regularly pioneering and giving small talks. I doubt she'll ever see things differently. The silver lining is that my brother and I now have a clearer understanding. We talk more openly about his doubts, his feelings of entrapment, and his dreams of a life beyond the JW. We've set up a sort of safety plan. If he feels he can't cope anymore, he'll call me, and I'll arrange for him to come here. He can live with me, finish high school in Chicago, and figure out what he truly wants to do in life, unencumbered by the pressure of a cult-like environment. I don't push him to do it right away. I understand how overwhelming that decision would be. He needs time to gather the courage to figure out how best to depart so he doesn't lose everything all at once. But knowing he has that option has already lightened his load. He's not as panicky on our calls. He even laughs more often, sharing silly memes and random stories about school. That small improvement in his outlook means the world to me. His revelations also reminded me of how alone I felt at his age, navigating the same controlling household. Every phone call with him feels like I'm rewriting a piece of my own past, offering him the support I never had. I tell him often that he's not broken, that he's not sinful for wanting a broader life or for questioning the strict codes of the Watchtower Society. He's allowed to explore different denominations or even consider no religion at all if he chooses. It's his life. That's a message I wish someone had given me when I was 16. I have no intention of reconciling with my parents, not unless they change drastically. They made their stance clear when they threw me out. They value their interpretation of religious doctrine over the well-being of their own child. I can't force them to accept me. After all this time, I found my own community of people who embrace me exactly as I am, and that includes my aunt and a circle of close friends who've become my true family. But I do hope quietly that one day my little brother can leave that oppressive environment and discover the same sense of freedom. If he decides he wants to maintain a relationship with our parents on his own terms, that's his choice. But at least he won't be stuck, reliant on their approval for every step of his life. Since he told me about the fake Instagram, I've locked down my actual social media accounts, making them private so my parents or sister can't easily spy on me. My brother thinks they might still believe I'm not entirely lost, which is easier for them than grappling with the fact that I'm a confident, openly gay man who has no intention of hiding. The knowledge that they're living in a fantasy about me used to bother me, but now I feel indifferent. If that delusion eases their consciences, so be it. I won't play along. I simply ignore any attempts to reach me through official congregation channels. My mother has made no further attempt at personal outreach, and my father remains silent. My sister is too busy proclaiming her faith and devotion online, occasionally alluding to her lost sibling in a cautionary tone. A few times, I've worried that my brother might second-guess our bond. What if my parents' pressure grows too strong and he's forced to cut me off again? That thought terrifies me, but he insists that he'll find a way to keep contact, even if it's through a secret phone or a friend's device. He's older now, and he sees the hypocrisy in everything they do. He's witnessed their cruelty, heard them use me as a negative example in congregational talks, cautioning other teens about the danger of straying into immoral behavior. It stings him to hear that. It makes him angry, but also more determined to leave as soon as he can handle it. Until then, we continue with our clandestine calls and texts. Sometimes we FaceTime at night after he's supposedly asleep. He'll whisper, so my parents won't hear his voice as he sits in a darkened corner of his bedroom. The dread I see in his eyes is a reminder of the environment I escaped. But there's also a spark of hope there, knowing he has options. He's grateful for that. And I'm grateful he reached out to me when he did, instead of waiting until he was 18 and full of resentment about being left behind. That's the shape of our relationship right now. Secretive, supportive, and tenuously balanced against the controlling gravitational pull of a devout JW household. It's not ideal, but it's infinitely better than the silence we had before. There's a beauty in how we've found each other across the divide our parents created. And if the day comes when he can step onto a train or a bus and come live with me, I'll be there waiting, arms wide open, ready to welcome him to a life free from judgment and rigid dogma. In the meantime, I'm simply living authentically, holding no illusions about what my parents or sister think. The chapter with them might be closed forever, but the chapter with my brother is still being written, full of potential for his own path. Perhaps the best conclusion to this story is that we've built a bridge between us, despite every obstacle thrown in our way. I've shown him that unconditional love is possible, and in a world that often feels divided by rigid beliefs, that's not a small thing. If he needs me tomorrow, I will come. If he needs me in 2 years, I will still come. The important part is that he knows finally that he's not alone. And that, more than anything else, feels like a triumph against an environment that tried so hard to keep us apart. Our parents might never understand or approve of who we are, but we've found a small, precious space where our bond as siblings can live and grow. For now, that's enough. And for the future, I have faith that the support system I can offer him will make all the difference once he's ready to break free.